Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. So now that we've talked about the contribution of classical theorists, the idea that if wages and prices are flexible, the economy can fix itself primarily through short-run aggregate supply, shifting left and right, it's time to spend some time on the other side of the philosophical aisle and take a look at Keynesianism. John Maynard Keynes, who it's named after, is pictured on the left, a more modern Keynesian who was based primarily out of Harvard University. John Kenneth Galbraith is on the right. Just like with classical theorists, these are two very prominent Nobel Prize winning economists, but they're not the only ones that represent this side of the aisle. If we take a look at unemployment figures for just over the last 100 years, it's pretty dramatic information, particularly when you're looking at the time of the Great Depression, when the unemployment rate was extremely high in the United States and other parts of the globe, in particular Great Britain. And so it became obvious that there were some shortcomings to the knowledge that people had regarding macroeconomics. As a matter of fact, right around the time of the Great Depression, you couldn't really clearly say that macroeconomics as a field of study had been invented, at least not until Keynes came along. But the classical theorists had some important contributions which did not look at the short run. They were very focused on the long run. The Great Depression demonstrated that we can't safely ignore the short run. Not only was there such extreme economic pain for a long stretch, but societies and political systems were destabilized because of the Great Depression. And as you probably know, the economic piece was a very important factor in the rise of the Nazis to power during this time period. So now most macroeconomists believe that the process of self-correction typically takes a decade or more when there is no government intervention. As this began to dawn on people back around the time of the Great Depression, it gave rise to the idea of macroeconomic policy activism, essentially the use of monetary and fiscal policy to smooth out the business cycle. Monetary policy having to do with banks and the money supply, particularly embodied with in the Federal Reserve System and the Board of Directors, the Fed, which serves as the central bank for the United States. Other countries have other central banks with different names, but also in the area of fiscal policy, which is a different area of focus for the government. Fiscal policy looks at the role that politicians play. In our case, Congress and the President are talking about what changes should be made at any one point in time to taxes and spending to try to give us the best picture that we possibly can get economically. So those two pieces are going to take a lot of our time for the next several lessons. But since policy activism was talking about smoothing out the business cycle, I think it's a good idea to review the business cycle once again. We had this diagram in an earlier lesson, and at the time of Keynes, the quantitative study of the business cycle was present. It was pioneered by Wesley Mitchell in 1920, who founded the National Bureau of Economic Research, which to this day still has the official role of declaring recessions and expansions. But if you recall, if you're looking at it using this visual, we have real GDP along this axis, and over time, as the quantity of real GDP increases, we have a recovery period if we've recently experienced a low point or a trough. If we get to a new high that we haven't experienced before, we can consider that an expansion until we hit our peak, and then we start to head back down again. Now, as I said a minute ago, most macroeconomists believe that this time period of going through an entire business cycle from peak to peak is a decade or more. Once we have two consecutive declining quarters of real GDP, that's the basic definition of a recession. And Keynes is one of the first people that came along and moved the measurement of the business cycle toward a theory of business cycles. And he had a very seminal, famous work to this day that he published in 1936 called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And one of his famous quotes associated with this work is, in the long run, we're all dead. So in other words, classical economists You say in the long run the economy is going to fix itself. Well, I say we can't wait around for that. We can't wait around for the economy to fix itself, because in the long run, while we're waiting for the economy to get back to long run equilibrium, we'll be dead. Figuratively or literally. We'll be starving, high rates of unemployment will have completely taken their toll, and in some cases, society's political systems will have upheaval that could lead to fascism, for example, as it did in the case of the Nazis. So Keynes advocated for an active stabilization policy, or the use of the government to reduce the severity of recessions, as well as rein in the excessively strong expansions that occur if necessary. And ultimately, he changed the game of economics in two major ways. One, as I said before, or at least that I alluded to, is he focused on the short term, where classical economists had not. Two parts to this. One, that in the short term, we should take a look at shifting AD as an essential component of output for an economy. They focused a lot on the supply, of course. He wanted to focus in the short term on aggregate demand and what role that would play in economic health. And also, speaking of supply, he visualized the short-run aggregate supply curve differently. This is a good visual here of the contrast between the two philosophies. The classical view was, in the short term, as you can see here, Sarras was vertical. But in the Keynesian view, it was sloped upward and to the right. And this makes important differences, as you're going to see later. The second point that Keynes was able to kind of change the game in was by arguing that other factors besides the money supply, this is really emphasized by classical theorists, but other factors beside that can shift aggregate demand. For example, business confidence.